This is Nathan Aberg with the Liberty Prairie Foundation. Welcome to our webinar today called Cover Crops for Soil Health and Insect Life. We have Dr. Mike Bredesen from the Ecdysis Foundation with us, so I'm really excited about that. Thank you, Mike. So this is part of a larger series that we began in June, and we have two more of these over the next 2 Thursdays as well, and I'll say more about that at the end. The purpose of this series is to provide helpful information to farmers and farmland owners about ways that farmland can be even better managed for life and for the success of farmers. We are in our marketing for this event giving special attention to farmland owners, both public and private. We value farmers and anyone else who's interested in farming, but one of the things we've realized is that 60% of Illinois farmland is rented out by people who don't farm it themselves. And oftentimes they're not given the encouragement and the support that they need to sort of really feel comfortable in partnering with their farmer to improve the stewardship of that farmland. And through this and other efforts, we're hoping to see that change over time. As way of introduction, we are the Liberty Prairie Foundation. We're a nonprofit private operating foundation located in the very northeast corner of Illinois in the Prairie Crossing Conservation Community in Grays Lake, Illinois. We own and manage a 94-acre organic farm. And through our programs in the farm, we demonstrate, support, and promote sustainable farming. And my particular program area is the Northeast Illinois Farm Link program. It's a land access program designed to bring together farmers and farmland owners, connect them if they're looking for each other, help them work out good long-term land access arrangements that will help them hopefully have the confidence and the relationship that they can do really good farmland stewardship. We're very grateful for our funder and our underwriter, which is Food Land Opportunity, localizing the Chicago Food Shed. This is a joint collaboration between the Chicago Community Trust and the Kinship Foundation. The purpose of that initiative is to grow and develop a resilient local food economy that protects and conserves land and other natural resources. And they have been extremely generous to others and many other good organizations in our region. Just a few notes about how this whole thing is going to work. I'm going to be introducing Mike in just a little bit. He's going to talk. He'll have 2 different segments. At the end of each segment, we'll have some questions. You can ask your questions through a chat system. I hope you can see the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just plug in your question and I'll moderate those as that goes along. This is being recorded. You'll be able to see the YouTube of this before long. We already have some of the other recordings of the previous webinars on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Liberty Prairie Foundation. And so again, I was mentioning public and private farmland owners. I do want to mention one public farmland owner in particular I want to give special credit to, and that's the McHenry County Conservation District. They are an innovative conservation district that are really giving some real excellent thought and energy to enhancing and rethinking their farmland management system for their 6,000 acres of farmland. We've been very honored to sort of help them a little bit with that, but it's great to see a public entity being really thoughtful about how they manage their farmland. When I was speaking with Ed Collins, the Director of Natural Resources there, he about what resources, what knowledge would really help them do better with their farmland management. He checked in with his staff, and there was a whole bunch of questions that came out. But one of the key questions is what's the connection between farming and insect life? Obviously, they're conservationists. They manage natural areas. They know the relationship between birds and insects and different things. And so that was the genesis of this webinar series. So I just want to give a shout out to the McHenry County Conservation District for that. And I think it's easy, sometimes for people to sort of think that a concern for insects is some sort of peripheral niche concern. But if regenerative agriculture is teaching us anything, it's that the more life there is in a farming system, the more we farm in nature's image, the better the soil is going to be, the better the soil erosion is going to be, more beautiful your landscape is going to be, the more enjoyable and creative your farming is going to be, and the more profitable you're going to be because you're not going to be having a lot of inputs required. So I believe, frankly, that insect life, insect diversity in a farm is one of those indicators of a farm's overall health and resilience over time. And so I think this is especially important. Very excited to have Mike here, Dr. Mike Bredesen. He's going to introduce himself. He's going to do a better job of that than I could. I did want to say just a few things about the Ecdysis Foundation, which he represents. Their website kind of provides a little background, and since they're a very unique institution, I wanted to share just very briefly some words from their website. It reads, Ecdysis Foundation started in 2016 behind the wheel of a rental car on a cross-country road trip home to South Dakota. Dr. Jonathan Lundgren had just been suspended from his federal position for presenting his research on the hopes of regenerative agriculture and problems of pesticide risks to farmers and the National Academy of Sciences. Driving through the endless miles where society had traded corn and soybeans for degraded rural communities, it was clear that something was deeply wrong with how science was being applied. Something had to change. So they created the Ecdysis Foundation. This is what they explain and what their purpose is. We can grow food and conserve biodiversity and environmental health. Agriculture can be used to solve many of the world's problems. And Ecdysis Foundation provides the research and development that can make innovative practices scalable and transferable to as many operations as possible. We anticipate a paradigm shift in the way food is produced in this country, and we want to have answers ready for farmers when they are ready to farm in nature's image. That's a really exciting mission. So happy to have you here, Mike. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, Nathan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. Yeah, like Nathan said, I'm a scientist for Ecdysis, and I've been here since day one. Before that, I worked with Dr. Lundgren, with John at the USDA facility, and when we decided to take our ventures elsewhere, it's been a pretty amazing result. We've been able to be sort of untied by bureaucracy and some of the other things that we felt like it was pinning us back earlier, and really the partnerships we've been able to forge with organizations like the one you represent, Nathan. It's really pushed the envelope so much further than we were ever able to before. And thanks so much for giving a good shout out to insects. I loved what you just mentioned about insects as an indicator. And really, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. Insects, we see it time and time again. The diversity and abundance of insects is such an indication of these other parameters that are less easy to see, like soil carbon, plant diversity, the availability of detritus, nutrient cycling, water infiltration. Some things that are a little bit more difficult to see, you can extrapolate just by looking at something that's a little bit more friendly to observe, and that is the insect community. And thanks for everyone showing up today, because we're going to talk a lot about bugs. I know that's why you're all here, because insects are all probably your favorite types of animals. So we're going to learn a little bit more about insects today. So just to make sure now, Nathan, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I am. Yep. You're all good.
Julio. Let's do this thing, folks. All right. So why Nathan invited me to be here is because my forte as an entomologist, as an agricultural researcher, is to look at how plant diversification on working lands, in rangelands, pastures, and more commonly with me specifically in croplands, when we diversify those communities, what the heck happens to the insect community, right? What happens to those pests that we worry about, the herbivores that are consuming our crops or pestering our animals or cattle? And then what's happening to the beneficial insect community, those things that are naturally tilling the soil, aerating the soil, helping water infiltrate, they're recycling nutrients, and what happens to those insects that are out there actively hunting those pests, right, to try and keep that balance of herbivores and predators out there. Okay, so that's exactly what I'm going to talk to you today about, is some of the research I've done over the last few years looking at cover crops, and more specifically, what happens when we put in cover crops and diversify a community, a cornfield that would otherwise just have a single species growing. So we're going to get into some specifics and also some generalities with what does it mean for an insect community when we add plant diversity there. So let me quit rambling and let's do this thing. Okay, who am I? I'm a scientist and I work for Ecdysis. We also work at Blue Dasher Farm. So Ecdysis is the nonprofit research foundation, and the place that most of us scientists and technicians are housed at is called Blue Dasher Farm in extreme eastern South Dakota, right on the South Dakota-Minnesota border. And so this picture in the upper right-hand corner is this summer's crew. We've already been down for a couple of weeks in Kansas doing all sorts of sampling on 40 farms down there, and then we just got back day before yesterday from a 55 farm study up in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So we are beat. If I have bags under my eyes, you know why. But anyways, I wouldn't be able to do it without this incredible crew that I work with, right? So that's who I do. That's my job, right? But what else drives me, right? Who else am I? I'm a farmer here. I farm with my dad and brother in South Central Minnesota, on a pretty average sized farm for the area. And I'm also a beekeeper, nothing fancy, just a hobbyist beekeeper. But right, these are all aspects of my life that drive my research and drive the decisions that I make. Okay, and above my job and above my farming and beekeeping, I'm an outdoorsman, right? So this is my wife and I and my dog Lucy there. When we're not working and for the lab, we're not working out in the field, this is where you can find us, right? Out in the nearest prairie, out in some of the CRP that I have surrounding my place out here, or out at the lake. So really, I'm trying to paint you a picture of who I am, right? I'm a farmer, my family farms, I'm an outdoorsman, and I'm a scientist, right? And really the outdoorsy part of me, and the fact that my family gains all their income from a farm, drives the research projects and decisions that I make as a researcher, right? So anything that I'm doing on the research side of things has to make sense when it comes to preserving natural resources, not just for the wildlife, but humans are nothing without healthy natural resources, right? And also anything I do in my research has to make sense logistically and economically when it comes to on the farm, right? A farm is only going to be a sustainable venture if the people running that farm are protecting the natural resources, but they're also able to make a good living doing it, right? Okay, so let's, now that you know a little bit about who I am, let's talk about what we came here to talk about, okay? And whenever someone says the word farmer, right, we all have an image painted in our mind of who that is and what that person looks like, okay? But really that the term farmer is it's all encompassing, right? A farmer just isn't a farmer. A farmer is an electrician, a veterinarian when your animals get sick, a mechanic, a plumber, your marketers, heavy equipment operators. You're the world's most important conservationists, right? And I think there's one word missing from this list, though. It's a very, very important word, and I think it applies to all land managers and farmers out there. And that's being an architect, right? Each one of us as farmers, we are responsible for designing the way the land that we manage looks and functions, right? So now that we can identify ourselves as being an architect, because that's absolutely what we are as land managers, let's think about what makes a really excellent architect, right? So architects, the really good ones out there, they design these spaces that are super efficient, very functional, and they work just so well for the workers that occupy that space, right? That the architect designs. You want those workers that occupy that space to do the best job that they possibly can do in that space that's been designed for them. So as land managers and farmers, I got a question for you. Who do you think is working for you and with you, right? So let's think about that. Okay, well, I'm not exactly talking about the hired man, or maybe you hire your nephew to drive the grain cart in the fall or drive the truck. So those are your employees, but you've got a lot of other things working for you on your farm, right? I'm trying to get at things like bacteria and fungi, right? Things that are cycling your nutrients. Rainfall, my goodness. Farmers, we love talking about rainfall. When's that next rain coming? We've always got too much, too little. Never, this time of year we're hoping to catch a couple more inches, right, during corn tasseling and soybean filling out. But the sunlight, right? The sunlight is working for you, right? We couldn't grow plants without sunlight. Insects, right? Earthworms. All of these things I want us to start looking at as our employees, okay? So, and they're all trying to make a living, trying to work as best as they can on the farmland that you manage. So as an architect of that farmland, how can I design it in a way so each one of these employees, each one of these components is doing the maximum amount of good work for you, right? And it's all free, which is the best part of it. These employees they're dirt cheap, right? But they're also the most important employees that you have. Okay, if we're going to be talking about architecture of land, right? There's no greater person or entity to take our lessons from, right? We want to learn from the best, okay? And there's no better than to look at the best herself, and that's Mother Nature, right? And this prairie here represents, a pretty typical, well-managed prairie here in the Midwest. And just think about it as you look at this picture, what are some of the things that first pop out to you? Okay, I'm looking at this picture, and this picture really, it screams diversity of all sorts, right? We've got structural diversity, we've got Indian grass up here, we've probably got some short grasses down here, little blue stems, we've got all sorts of different types of flowering plants. We even have different ages of plants. Heck, even on the soil surface down here, we've got dead plant matter that's 1, 2, 3 years old at different stages of in the nutrient cycle, right? So it screams diversity, okay? And that diversity in this ecosystem provides function, right? On that second bullet point, prairies, they offer ecosystem functions. And what am I talking about? Okay, the functions that this environment provides to us is, okay, wildlife habitat. We see that. I'm a big pheasant hunter. Maybe some of you are hunters out there. I bet so. Okay, erosion prevention. Okay, the diversity, constant ground cover. You never see a prairie blowing like this. Here's a tilled soybean field, and then a drift of snow and soil working its way over into this DNR land that I like to pheasant hunt on. Okay, so it's a perfect example. Okay, the diversity, it waters, infiltrates, and purifies water. Okay, it is a sink for carbon, right? Okay, we pump oil and carbon out of the ground and burn it. Well, one of the only places that we can put carbon once it's up in the atmosphere is in plant matter and then back into the soil. Okay, and then of course the reason why we're here is, and the most important reason, of course, is that I'm just kidding, by the way, but insect communities, extremely diverse and robust and persistent insect communities can be found in these natural, diverse prairies, right? Because they're designed in a way to offer extreme function. Okay, now let's look at the flip side. Okay, this is a very typical scene, right? I'm in this type of habitat almost on a daily basis looking at insect communities. Okay, and let's just take a moment to sort of compare this photo from what we've seen in the previous slide, right? Okay, so this is a corn monoculture. It's one single plant species growing out there. And let's think about the kind of functions and services that this type of habitat is able to provide based on the way that it's managed and been designed, okay? Right, we know for a fact that in these types of environments, we struggle with erosion, okay? This is a photo we pulled over summer before last. I'm in a ditch. We were driving across South Dakota, my wife and I, to go to a wedding, and we were stopped by the highway patrol because there was a stretch of road where we could not travel because of the low visibility due to blowing soil. So this is all soil and plant residue starting to fill up a ditch. Okay. All right, we know that low diversity systems have trouble infiltrating water. Okay, it can be a pretty poor area for wildlife habitat. It's actually a source for carbon. There's a lot of carbon that enters the atmosphere. All right, and then herbivore outbreaks tend to be pretty prevalent in these types of habitats. And we're going to get into sort of why, right, with that last point. Why do we struggle with herbivores and pests in a habitat that looks like this when we never see an insect outbreak happen in a sort of a natural, diverse prairie system? Okay, again, we're looking at that sort of golden image of what the pinnacle of diversity can do as far as functioning on a piece of land, right? Okay, so why are pests an issue at all in monocultures, right? So a population of a pest, okay, is dependent on all sorts of different things, okay? A few things that we do know, right? But there are many, many reasons that scientists, we have no idea why exactly a pest population or any insect population is why it is. But of those things that we do know, we can group them into two categories, right? So what controls a pest population has to do with these top-down or bottom-up factors. And what exactly do I mean? Think about it like this. Top-down factors that control a pest population would be something that, basically eats the pest, okay? The pest population is going to have a hard time if there's more things out there that are eating it, okay? Pest population probably going to do pretty good if it doesn't have to worry about getting eaten, okay? So that's a pretty easy one to conceptualize. But how about this other weird factor that I have written up here, the bottom-up factors? And these are a little bit tougher to think about, but these are all the factors that we lump into this category that are plant-mediated factors. Okay, and so I'll explain a little bit more here. When a pest flies into a prairie like this and it's looking for one specific kind of plant that it needs, it has to have in order to develop into its full life cycle, it can be really difficult for that pest to successfully find and navigate its way through that type of habitat due to the diversity to find, eat, and reproduce, right? And that's a very difficult thing. But imagine if we have a much more simplified system. It's a lot easier for these pests to overcome those plant-mediated bottom-up factors, right? It's really easy for a pest to fly into a soybean field if that's what it's looking for, or a cornfield, and find its host plant. It doesn't have much trouble at all, right? Okay, so again, why are we having such issues with pest populations in monocultures, right? Well, so we don't provide the resources necessary for these top-down, these predators to really maintain an excellent, robust community, an army, if you will, out in our agricultural land. Okay, and then as I just mentioned, it's super easy. It's so easy if you are a corn pest in this type of habitat down here in this picture to find exactly what you need to survive, right? It's no trick at all. You don't have to expend hardly any energy to get to that corn plant, feed, make babies, and your babies make more babies, okay? So when we eliminate via our design, right, since we are architects of our of our croplands. When we eliminate all the factors that make it difficult for a pest to survive, well, it results pretty quickly in a pest population growing pretty rapidly. Okay, so what do we know then? What are some of the best farmer architects doing? Okay, how are they changing the design in order to favor them, right? Well, they're using more of an ecologically based farming approach. Okay, and they're doing this, right? They're trying to manage pest populations, of course, and that's what we're talking about mostly today. But it's not just the insect community, right? They're using ecology to manage weed populations, to more rapidly sequester carbon and make their soils more resilient. They want to prevent erosion. They want to infiltrate and store water as best they can, right? So they're using as many ecological principles that they know of based on the knowledge that they've gained from the archetype, right? The prairie system. I don't care who you are. Every time you walk into a prairie, especially if you're someone like me who farms, you can take a nugget of information every time you walk into a well-managed prairie and say, now I see how Mother Nature does it. I'm going to try, if I can, to figure out how to take that nugget of information and make it happen on my own land. Okay, so right, these farmers are bringing it back to insects. They're using ecologically based pest management, and what that really entails is just adding more diversity. Okay, and how do we do that? How do we add more diversity on farmland? I'm sure some of you out there, some of you farmers and some of you landowners, some of your renters are probably doing some of these things, right? Crop rotation, right? The more complex crop rotation can do wonders for breaking a pest cycle. Some folks will actually put in permanent perennial strips, right, to have refuge for insects to overwinter and recolonize our croplands and our pastures the following year. Cover crops are a huge one, usually grown outside of a cropping window, but we're going to get into a little bit more of how we can use cover crops maybe during the cropping window. Multiple varieties. Okay, this is always a head scratcher for me, why we don't do this more often. Okay, there's a pile of research out there that shows us that simply, if you're going to grow a monoculture, let's say we're just growing soybeans, okay, even mixing multiple varieties of the same species of plant, whether it be corn, wheat, soybeans. Let's say we have we have a field of soybeans. Just by mixing multiple varieties, even of the same maturity length, can have profound impacts on reducing disease and pest populations, right? Makes it really difficult for diseases to move from plant to plant, or from insect pests to move from plant to plant. So there's a really low-hanging fruit, easy nugget of info that you guys can hopefully take from today and apply it next year in the field. Buy a couple varieties of the same day length, mix them in there. It's easy as that, okay? And as we get more down the sort of regenerative pathway in ecologically based farming, we see more and more people adopting livestock, okay? And after adopting, one species of livestock, even then mixing species within a herd can really do some amazing things when it comes to pest management, okay, and attracting a diverse and robust insect community. Okay, so if you're doing all of these things, all of those ways of adding diversity, a farmer usually still looks at these and says, okay, I'm doing a good job, but still, during that phase of corn or soybeans, I usually still have just corn or soybeans growing out of there. How can I diversify that big chunk of the growing season? And what a lot of the most cutting edge and innovative farmers are doing is they're starting to interseed cover crops. Okay, so what is interseeding cover crops, right? Really, it is just adding diversity and making use of an unfilled niche, right? A niche is an ecological term. Basically, it's when there is a space that something wants to grow. Mother Nature would never have a scene like this, right? There would always be some sort of diversity taking advantage of this open resource, right? So we're trying to mimic those natural scenes by interseeding, okay, and making a situation look more like this, okay? This is one of the research plots I had at the Dakota Lakes Research Farm. Some of you might have heard of Dwayne Beck and the Dakota Lakes Research Farm. He was my PhD advisor. And here he's got some perennial alfalfa, right? This is actually Roundup Ready alfalfa that he has growing in strips in some of his cropland year after year, right? So it's a little bit different take on interseeding cover crops, but he's able to manage it that way and fix a heck of a lot of nitrogen even during the growing season of corn, right? It adds structure, it adds function. Getting back to that image, okay, what does the prairie look like? How can that prairie act so well and be so efficient despite us giving it nothing, okay? Right, and then down here, a good friend of mine that doesn't live too far away here, this year he's well versed in interseeding cover crops. He wanted to take it a step further this year, and he's doing twin row corn, and then he's skipping a row to interseed cover crops, you know, and he's a firm believer in having pollinating plants, and he gets into his mixture, right? He's got a pretty diverse mixture in there, faba beans, buckwheat, flax, cereal, rye, and some sort of squash. He loves squash for interseeding. He says it's the best weed suppressor you can have. Okay, so this is what interseeding is. It's trying to make use of an unfilled niche, right? And there's a couple different ways that we usually see adding cover crops or adding diversity during the growing season, right? And the first way is by crop interseeding, right? Either relaying one crop after the other or planting them together, harvesting them both at the same time at the end of the year, and then separating them out later on. Okay, here's a friend of mine. He does a lot of this companion cropping, and then as a seed separator on a trailer, he can move around to different farms that separate their seeds afterwards. It's a great system if you have, if you can pair together two species that work well together, right? More commonly, we see interseeding, not by having an additional crop, but by utilizing cover crops, okay? And we typically see this happen is that after your corn, soybeans, or what have you has emerged and is well on its way to growing, you come in with a different implement and you plant cover crops out in that established crop, okay? That's what we see most commonly happening. Okay, and how does interseeding, how does diversifying these croplands aid in pest management, all right? And remember our teacher, okay? Let's always remember how she does it, how she is the best architect she can be. All right, so thinking about that, we're trying to bolster the community of those top-down predators, right? Those things that keep our pests in check by directly hunting and eating them, eating their larvae, eating their eggs, okay? Preying upon them, right? Removing that pest completely from the environment. All right, and I have a couple of videos, right? And I want to reiterate, what does a farmland need in order to promote and maintain a beneficial insect population? Well, they need four things, and it's really a SNAP to remember it, right? Because the word SNAP is a great acronym to remember, right? So beneficial insects need shelter, right? Really, it's the same as us, right? We need a place to stay, not only during the season, but we need a place to have babies, right? And have them grow up, right? So there can't be any sort of significant disturbances that's gonna mess up that cycle. So shelter, nectar, carbohydrate resource, alternative prey, and then pollen, SNAP, shelter, nectar, alternative prey, pollen. Okay, so remember those things. It's a SNAP to have a beneficial insect community on your farm. So here's out in my garden. I just want to show a bee here, and its hind legs are just completely packed with pollen, right? So we're not just attracting predators, but also we can attract pollinators if we have enough diversity out there. Here's a sunflower plant. It's one of my favorite cover crops to grow because you don't have to wait for certain plants, including the sunflower, in order to have nectar resources. Some plants have nectaries all over their bodies, right? If you think about a sunflower, here's a sunflower leaf. I don't know if you can see my video or not, but here's the leaf and here's the petiole that connects it to the stalk. Sunflowers are this great organism where they've got, throughout the entire season, they push sugar. I'll just point to it on here. They push sugar out of their leaf veins, right? And you get all sorts of these beneficial wasps and beneficial ants and beetles coming and just taking this free treat of nectar all year long. It's a great way of attracting and maintaining an army of beneficials before a pest population's ever there, right? So they can be there and established for when the bad guys, the pests, do end up showing up. Your army, if you will, can nip that issue in the bud before they ever get a chance to take hold in your fields. Okay, so here's this ant. He's just filling his crop with finding those leaf margins and just gobbling up all that great sugar. Okay. All right, so having predators, how exactly do predators keep a pest population under control? Well, you might think it's really intuitive, really easy, right? If you have predators there, think about the lion on the Serengeti, right? You're not going to have all that many. Your gazelle population is not going to be as high because you have lions consuming the gazelle, right? So same thing, you have these crazy looking out of this world beetles, spiders, ants, right? All sorts of crazy looking things crawling around on top and below the soil surface that are just eating the heck out of pests. Okay, so that's easy. But something that people don't know, and I think is absolutely fascinating, it's one of the coolest things I've ever learned as an ecologist and entomologist, is that you can reduce your pests' feeding and their reproductive success just by having more predators around, not necessarily eating them. And let me explain, right? So let's say, remember back to middle school. Okay, we're all sitting at the middle school lunch table, and you sat down with your big tray of food, okay? And if you're sitting around all your own friends, you're gonna gobble up your lunch, no problem. You're gonna feel good, right? You might even feel good enough to ask out that girl you've been thinking about to the school dance, right? Life is good, nothing's bothering you. You're able to do exactly what you need to do. Well, let's say you sit down at the middle school lunch table with your food, and you know the school bully comes and sits down right across from you. It doesn't matter whether or not the bully is going to do anything to you right then and there, but I'm willing to bet that you're not thinking about asking that girl to the dance, and you're not definitely going to have enough appetite to munch all your food, right? It's not going to sit well with you. You might even try and finish early and not eat all of it. The same exact thing happens out in our agricultural fields, and there's been some really interesting studies with predators. When we remove the ability of a predator to kill a pest, but still have that predator out there, that pest has lower feeding efficiency and much less reproduction, right? And predators, they give off odors, right? We all have our own specific odors. Well, so do insects, right? And just by smelling that there are more predators in an area, right? Pests spend less time feeding and less time mating, right? So it's a wonderful, fascinating bit of ecology that I hope that you all take away from this, right? Just by having more predators out there, not by necessarily eating the pests, but just by being there, being the bully that prevents them from taking a foothold in your farm. Okay, so we talked about how can interseeding aid in pest management, right? So we're by adding cover crops, we're adding more structure, more alternative prey, more pollen, more nectar to attract this army, right? These bullies to the field, okay? All right, what about the bottom up effects that we talked about, okay? All right, as I mentioned before, you want a pest to have a hard time finding the plants that they want to find, okay? I had another example I was going to use of someone sort of at a buffet, but I'm going to skip that over. Right, let's think about this for a second. I'll just tell you, insects, pests, especially herbivores, they usually have really bad eyesight, right? They can see green, right? They can see a field of green. What they really do to hone in on a corn plant, a soybean plant, a wheat plant, is they smell it. Insects have this incredible ability to smell the plants that they want to attack and eat and reproduce on. Okay, but when we have confusing, they're called olfactory or smell signals coming from a field, it's really difficult for a pest to come in and find exactly the right host plant, right? To find your crop to start eating and reproduce and doing damage, okay? And it doesn't take a lot of some other plant species growing, a cover crop growing in there, to really confuse a pest when it's trying to search and find its host plant. And it's something we actually call the flypaper effect. Okay, so the more times that a pest flies into your field and lands on something that's not your crop, it has a much higher likelihood of getting attacked by a predator. And it's also using a heck of a lot of energy, which it would otherwise use for reproduction and population explosion, right? So really, you guys, we're getting into some really in-depth ecology on how insect populations work in croplands and how they and how their communities interact with each other based on plant diversity. So I know we're getting in a little bit into depth, but I always find that it's really important to know sort of the nuts and bolts of the ecology, because my fields are going to look a little bit different than your fields over in Illinois, right? Slightly different. But the principles, if we learn those, they're adaptable, right? You guys can take these nuggets of info and utilize them and learn and take it to heart on your own operations. Okay, so there's sort of my intro. Now, all that is in theory, right? It's all pie in the sky. I can say that adding diversity to your cropland by cover cropping and interseeding cover crops will do all of those things, right? It's going to promote beneficial insects and it's going to suppress pests. But let's try and put the proof in the pudding here, okay? I'm going to talk to you now about this study that I've conducted the last 3 years, looking at the insect community in corn monocultures and in cornfields where we have a diverse mix, a complex mix of cover crops growing. Okay, so let's walk through this together. All right, I did this at 3 different farms, right? And at each farm, I had 8 separate fields, okay? Half of those fields were corn monocultures, and then half of the fields were interseeded with cover crops. And these are pretty big plots, right? They're not just a couple meters by a couple meters, right? 42 by 42 meters. So pretty sizable areas. Okay, on the right side there, you can see the mixture of cover crops that I used during this study. All pretty common things that you see in a cover crop mixture. And all things that were utilized because we knew that they would add a lot of benefit, right? We've got some flowering things in there, some legumes to fix nitrogen, some grasses to mobilize phosphorus and help with water infiltration. And these are all things that are not going to interfere with corn harvest, right? They're all pretty low-lying things. Okay, and in year 1 of the study, we interseeded our cover crops the old-fashioned way, right? And we did hand broadcasting out in some of these farms, really conventional farms is where we were doing these studies. And the second year, we got a little bit fancier because what we were finding is that the stand establishment of our interseeded cover crops was so much better when we were able to get a little bit better seed to soil contact. So we went to the ag salvage yard and tore off a bunch of units from an old hay buster no-till drill and mounted them on an old International cultivator toolbar. And then we had a farmer that was a good friend that had a couple of these Gandy box seed or fertilizer regulators. And we're able to slap this thing together and make a really functional 7-row interseeder for less than $1,000. And you know, and it looks like a big octopus crawling through the field, but it works really good. Okay, and so here's a little video I'll play of what a corn monoculture. This is in one of my plots that was corn monoculture. Okay, and again, I want you to be thinking like architects. Your designers have the image of the prairie, the most functional system that we know of, in mind. And then also think like an insect. Okay, what resources do I need in order to make this a permanent home and do my job as an employee for this farmer the best I can? Okay, so hopefully you can see this running. Most of us have walked through a monoculture cornfield before. It's pretty typical, quite a bit of bare soil. And here's a short clip of what an interseeded cover crop field looks like. This is a field that just has one single row of cover crops growing down in between corn plants. Okay, lots of flax plants. We've got mung beans growing out there, some of the cereal rye and laying down. It's definitely a different type of habitat, right? Quite a bit more structure there. Quite a bit more of the soil being covered. Okay. All right, so now that we've got the plots established, we need to go out there and actually see who's living out there in these plots. I'm trying to attract insects, trying to see what the interseeding does to the insect communities. What do these cover crops do? So on the corn plants themselves, right, on the corn foliage, we did this by going out and actually dissecting corn plants, okay? We did this on a ton of corn plants, right? Over the life of the study, it's been almost 1,100 corn plants. So very, very robust, right? We know at this point who's living on corn plants in both of these types of fields, those monoculture fields and those that have an interseeded cover crop. Okay, now that we know how to look on the corn plants, what about on the soil surface? Okay. And we do that by taking this metal quadrat, we pound it into the ground so nothing can escape. And then we stay here until we've sucked out all insects that are living on the soil surface within that area. Okay, and we've done this on a pile of samples too, almost 300 samples throughout the project. And again, I should reiterate this. On the corn plants and for on the soil surface, we did this at 3 times during the growing season. First time was at the V4 stage, so 4 leaves, V8, which is the 8-leaf stage, and then during anthesis, which is when corn is shedding its pollen. Okay, now that we know how to look on the corn plants, we've looked on the soil surface. What about underneath the soil surface, right? Who's living within the soil? And we went out and we did this. The best way to do this is actually just taking a device like this, same thing they use on golf courses to cut out the hole. Right? We take a big soil core, bring it back to the lab, and we extract all the insects out of the soil, right? Using a hot light bulb that dries the soil. Insects scramble down, 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 and into a collection jar where we can then, under the microscope, sort things apart, identify, and count. All right, so what did we find? We found a pile of insects, right? So if you look up here, the number of arthropods, I should call them invertebrates. Not all of them are insects, but they're all invertebrates, right? Almost 64,000 specimens. So you can imagine, I spent a lot of time under the microscope. And within cornfields, you wouldn't believe the diversity of species of animals living out there, right? Just in cornfields, we get over 500 species of animals, right? That's pretty mind-blowing if you ask me. Okay, but now let's break it down further. Okay, let's find out who exactly was living on corn plants, on the soil surface, and then below the soil, and compare corn monocultures to corn that's interseeded with cover crops. All right, so here's my first of a couple graphs, and don't panic, I'm going to talk things through here. Hopefully you can see my cursor here. On the left side, we have the number of insects, right, living per corn plant, okay? 2, 4, 6, 8 insects per corn plant, right? And that's average. And down here on the bottom, we have throughout the season. So this is early in the season, middle of the season, and then late in the season. And the black or the filled in dots represent the number of insects on corn plants that were in cover crop plots. So remember, the filled in dot is like a filled in row with cover crops, right? So dark dots mean filled in with cover crops. Whereas nothing, the empty dot just means empty rows, corn monoculture. Okay, so on corn plants themselves, all right, early in the season, nothing, no difference, right? Maybe our interseeded cover crop wasn't along far enough. Okay, middle of the season, late of the season, okay, maybe we see actually a couple more total invertebrates or insects on corn plants that don't have any cover crops, right? So just bare monoculture corn, it looks like maybe a couple more insects on those plants than when we have cover crops. It's kind of a head scratcher if you ask me. Okay, let's take it a step further here. So we're looking at all insects lumped together. But let's break down the community a little bit more. What about just predators? When we look at just the predator community, well, you know, not a lot of excitement if you ask me again, right? We see almost no difference early, middle, and late in the season between corn plants that have cover crops versus are just corn. Right, this is kind of a major bummer if you ask me, right? Like, I'm a farmer and I'm planting interseeded cover crops out there. I'm hoping to get more predators out there. So where the heck are all of them? All right, and then let's look at just the pests, okay? Just the pests, right? And here are dark dot, early in the season, no difference. Later on, we see, gosh, when I have corn monocultures, it looks like I may actually have a couple more pests when I just have corn in monoculture versus corn with interseeded cover crops. But you know, the difference isn't really all that big. I was hoping personally to see this huge difference, right? I wanted to see way more predators on my interseeded corn, and I wanted to see way more pests. You know, that's what I was expecting, right? So this is really kind of unexpected stuff. On corn plants, it turns out that having cover crops interseeded didn't make much of a difference, right? So that's kind of disappointing. What a snooze fest so far. Kind of a boring presentation. Wait, all right, so if you've been snoozing, wake up now, because this is where things get really interesting, okay? We just got done talking about on corn plants themselves. What about on the soil surface? Okay, it's a totally different community. This is where things get exciting for me, right? Total insects, we collected almost 8,100 specimens looking on the soil surface. More than twice as many were found on the soil surface when we had an interseeded cover crop versus when corn was just in monoculture here. So we have these two pictures are a good representation of what that looks like, right? We've got bare ground in between corn plants here on the left. And right here is a downward looking picture when we have interseeded cover crops. I see flax, I see my grass is growing underneath, and then mung beans are really spreading out quite a lot, okay? And what about the diversity of insects that we're seeing out here? This is also tremendously different whether or not we have cover crops there. Right, so when we have cover crops growing in our corn, on an average per plot, we have over 61 species we'd find in each plot versus when there's just corn, less than 40, right? So this huge difference, a 50% increase in the total number of different species just by adding a few different species of cover crops, right? So that's pretty tremendous. Now let's do what we did for the on corn plants and break this down throughout the season. Okay, we're lumping all insects together. This is pests, this is beneficials, this is everything. Again, early in the season, middle of the season, and then late in the season. And here's the number of insects that we have per square meter, right? Per square meter on the ground. All right, and this is pretty cool if you ask me, right? When we have an interseeded cover crop in these filled in dots, early in the season, we have more than twice as many, right? Or nearly twice as many, excuse me, insects on the soil surface running around as we do when there's nothing there in corn monocultures. And then later on in the season, we see this explosion where we're attracting a pile of insects to our interseeded plots compared to just corn monocultures. Okay, so what are they though? This is all insects grouped together, good, bad, and ugly. Let's look at the goods, right? The predators, okay? Now, if I'm a farmer looking at this and I interseeded cover crops, right, represented here, I'm thinking, heck yeah, baby. I'm going to go find Mike, that scientist guy, and buy him a beer because it worked. Right, I've got piles of predators, more than twice as many, usually in my interseeded fields than when I just have a corn monoculture, right? So my field is getting protected. Biological control, that's what we're talking about. Pests, beware, right? I'm not going to have to use insecticides. So what about our herbivores, right? Let's look at those plant feeders, pests. Okay, so this graph is the plant feeders, right? And really here, this is where, if I'm a farmer, it's raining on my parade. Okay, why? Because in my interseeded plots throughout the season, I'm finding more herbivores, more plant feeders in plots that have an interseeded cover crop versus what I see down here in my corn monocultures. All right, now I'm not going to buy that dumb scientist a beer anymore because although I have more predators out there, I also have more herbivores, more pests. So I'm going to go find that skinny scientist and grab him by the neck and ask him what's going on. Okay, and this was kind of disheartening to see, right? I didn't exactly want to see more herbivores. At least when I was first doing the study, I thought, man, that must be a bad thing. Okay, but let's remember back for a second. We've all seen this graph before, right? We're talking about on the soil surface here, okay? Before we talked about what's happening on corn plants themselves. And we've already seen this, right? We already saw later on in the season, I actually had more pests on corn plants when they were in monoculture and less pests on corn plants when there was an interseeded cover crop, right? So how does this make any sense? When I look on the soil surface, I'm finding more herbivores, but when I go up on the corn plant, I'm seeing actually fewer when there's an interseeded cover crop. So what is happening here, okay? In a field, in a cornfield that has an interseeded cover crop, what's going on is we are seeing more herbivores here, not because these herbivores are the kind of pests that eat corn plants. The kinds that we're finding are cereal aphids and things that like to consume peas and beans, right? So these pea aphids. So this got me really excited when I started to dig into the data, is that why we're seeing more insects, more herbivores on the soil surface is because we're getting down there, we're knocking these things off of the interseeded cover crops, right? These are insect herbivores that want nothing to do with corn plants at all. They can't, in fact, survive on corn. So they're searching out the cover crops. Remember what I talked about before about how to attract and maintain beneficial insect communities? It's a snap, right? You need shelter, you need nectar, you need, that third one is really hard to come by, alternative prey resources, right? And we've done it here, we've done it, right? So we have alternative prey, the things that are consuming the cover crops. They're searching out my peas, they're searching out the cereal rye, the what else? The flax, things like that. And they're consuming those plants. They want nothing to do with the corn. But I'm also able to attract beneficial insects to this area in order to eat those pests and hopefully stick around for if there's ever a need to protect my corn plants, right? So hopefully I did a good job explaining that. I may have rambled a little bit. Suffice it to say, why we're seeing more herbivores on the soil surface when there's cover crops is because they're attracted to this stuff right here, right? This wonderful resource of plant material that these non-crop pests are coming in to feed on. And it's a really, really, really key and important thing. And it's not something that anyone's really been able to observe before. Entomologists always say, well, you need to have alternative prey, but no one's been able to show it, right, in their data before until now. All right, so we've looked on the corn plants, we've looked on the soil surface. What's happening below the soil surface when we interseed cover crops? Okay, this is where the bulk of insects are found, folks. Is the soil is truly alive, right? Almost 46,000 specimens we collected, and in interseeded plots, a few more. We found a few thousand more versus in monocultures, okay? And what is really interesting is that when we run the statistics, right, we use fancy equations to figure out the diversity of organisms. We found that interseeded plots had a more diverse community of insects below the soil surface than monocultures did, okay? And let's look at this. Throughout the growing season, we took soil samples 4 times through the growing season instead of 3 for the other graphs we've been looking at, right? So really early in the season, pretty early, kind of late, and then really late. Okay, and it's really amazing, right? If you interseed cover crops into your cornfields throughout the entire season, you're able to provide them a habitat which allows for a greater abundance of those animals than if you just have corn growing. Okay, and that's total invertebrates, right? And let's look, before I get ahead of myself, let's look at this V4 date here. Okay, interseeded fields. How many, if we look over here, about per square meter, we had almost 18,000 animals per square meter. 18,000 animals per square meter when we interseed with cover crops. Now that's a little bit hard to conceptualize, right? Per square meter, how big is that? What I could conceptualize though is the size of my foot. I wear a size 12 boot, and I wanted to know how many animals I was stepping on every time I took a step in my interseeded cornfields, right? And on that date, at V4, the most abundant date, every step that I took, I was stepping on 604 animals below the soil surface. Size 12 boot, 604 animals within the top 10 centimeters of soil. Now, if that doesn't like drop your jaw, I don't know what will, right? It's absolutely insane to think that there's that many animals, right? Living, breathing, reproducing, feeding, pooping animals below your feet out in a healthy soil. Okay, so this graph is, again, it's all insects grouped together. What about the predators? Okay, at every time we went out through the season, we found more predators. Sometimes the gap was bigger than others, but when we had an interseeded cover crop, we had more predators below the soil surface, right? Those filled in dots. Herbivores, like it was similar to the results that we found when we were looking on the soil surface, right? We were knocking a lot of things off of those interseeded cover crops, finding a lot of things like aphids and whatnot that were feeding on those pea plants, on the rye plants, okay? Now, this group here, detritivores. I wonder if anybody out there knows what the term detritivores. If you ever listen to Ray Archuleta, he loves the term detritosphere, right? And what that really is the layer of soil that contains all the dead plant matter, right? It's not quite soil yet, and it's not living, but it's somewhere in between. It's in a state of decay. And there's this gigantic group of animals, right? Insects, that this is what they eat, right? They eat dead plant matter, or they eat the bacteria and the fungi that are growing on that dead plant matter. And it's all a part of this nutrient cycle, right? The bacteria and fungi, they break it down. The insects, they shred it. They eat the fungi and bacteria, and they poop out stable soil aggregates along the way. The way some of these insects' digestive tracts work is they take in fungus, bacteria, bits of clay, bits of dead plant matter, cellulose. They bind it together in their guts and digest it. And as it goes through, there's like this membrane that covers what they've consumed, right? And they're literally, as they go, eating and pooping out stable soil aggregates on the way out, right? So when it comes to improving your soil's health, right, as a farmer, as a landowner, the more that we can promote these types of insects in your soil, you're going to have ultra fast nutrient cycling. You're going to have aggregate stability increase. And if you can imagine having almost being able to design your system in a way where you've got more than twice as many of these critters in your fields just by adding cover crops, well, your soil is going to be able to improve much more rapidly than if you're in a much less diverse system. Okay, and what am I talking about here? What things are crawling around below the soil surface? This is a view through the microscope at one of the soil samples that we take. And you guys can see all the dirt, the aggregates and some bits of sand and whatnot. But everything that you see that's shiny here, all these shiny guys you're seeing, these are all mites, right? And they're consuming fungi, bacteria, detritus. All these purple guys, springtails. These are all invertebrates that all they're doing constantly, you guys, they don't sleep ever. All they're doing day and night is milling about in your soil and making it a healthier place. Okay, so big deal. We found out that when we interseed cover crops in our cornfields, we can change the way that insect community looks, right? In some areas we find much more diverse insect communities, and almost in all places we find more abundance, especially of beneficial invertebrates, right? So big whoop, right? I want to know if all those predators out there are just there, or are they actually adding more function to my cornfield, right? Are they consuming the pests that I want them to be consuming? So we can test this. And the way I did this in both of these types of fields was we used what's called a wax moth sentinel, right? So we used this type of larvae that doesn't have very many defenses on its own. We pin it through the butt to a piece of clay, and we bury it out in the field. And we did a whole pile of these in fields that either had interseeded cover crops or were just in a corn monoculture. And the stage we did it was during towards the end of the summer when pollen was shedding. Okay, when we go out to the field, we put these larvae that are pinned through the butt, and they're still alive. We boil them. We bury them so that they're near the soil surface, right? Easily accessible to any sort of active predators that are in the area. And then we leave them for 1 hour. That's all it takes, 1 hour, and we come back. And we sneak up on these, and we figure out whether or not the larvae is living, is dead, is it still there, is it gone? Or if there's someone actively eating that organism, what is there? What's actually eating it? Okay, after an hour, we'll come back. Maybe we'll see a big carabid beetle like this getting a free lunch. And sometimes all we come back to is just a pile of guts, right? And we don't know who's been there, but we do know that that has been preyed upon, right? There was a predation event. So it's a good way of us figuring out sort of a general rate of predation for a type of habitat. And the two habitats, again, that we're comparing is corn monoculture versus a diversified cornfield with cover crops. Okay, and here's a little video of a Pteristicus beetle. It's just a carabid ground beetle that many of your fields have And they're voracious predators, not only of insects, but also of weed seeds. So it's a great little insect. But this little guy thinks it died and went to heaven and is bellying up to the buffet here. So that's a predation event. Okay, here's another couple of carabid beetles that are taking advantage of this.
Mike, will we be able to stop for questions pretty soon?
Yeah, very, very quick. Just a couple more slides, and I'll have my my natural break here.
Okay, great.
Okay, and so we did that, right? We did over 1,000 of these observations. And what would you expect to find, right? So we know that there's more predators out when we have cover crop fields, cover crops in our corn. But we don't know if that's really going to translate to a lot more predation. And here I'm about to show you a graph. Okay, and here on the left side is the percentage of larvae per field that were preyed upon after that 1 hour, right? Which percentage of larvae that were attacked in that 1 hour. And this bar on the left side will be from corn monocultures, and the right will be from the cover crops. Okay, right? And so I anticipated cover crops to have a little bit better predation. What I didn't expect is for it to be more than twice as much, right? So for each larvae that we placed out in the field, when we had a cover crop there, it had more than twice, greater than twice the likelihood that it was going to be consumed and eaten and killed when we had one single row of a simple cover crop mixture growing in between corn plants, right? All right, so take home messages from this study that I've just gotten over, right? Is that when we have cover crops growing between our rows, the foliar community, the corn plants, during my study, they didn't change very much, right? The corn plants were healthy. Predators and herbivores, pests weren't very prevalent on those corn plants. But when we looked at the soil surface, my goodness, things changed, right? We found more species, more insects altogether, and predators like crazy on the soil surface. We found more herbivores, but remember, they were not corn pests, right? They were consuming the cover crop tissue, which ended up being a very good thing for attracting more predators to our field. And then within the soil, we saw our numbers go up, right? But we had a greater amount of diversity within the insect community, and then much, much greater predator activity when it came to consuming those wax moth larvae when we had cover crops versus not, right? So not only did we see the form of the insect community change, but we also saw the function change as well based on having cover crops. Okay, and Nathan, if you would like, if there are any questions now, let's take them before I have one more little project to talk about, and it's don't worry, it's much shorter than the last one. It's just not very long at all.
Okay, so let me just hit a few. There's Carrie, I'm going to get to your questions when Mike finishes the whole presentation. You have some more specific questions about farming. I think that fits better. There was a question from Chris about, does the interseeding of cover crops translate to higher yields? Is there any data around that? You want to tackle that one, Mike?
I can, yeah, and I can show, because I knew I didn't have a lot of a super long time to talk. I have my graphs for that at the very end of the talk. I can bring them up. Suffice it to say that at the 3 farms that I did this, I had the yield between the interseeded versus the non-seeded cornfields went each of 3 ways, right? At one location, I actually had improved yield in my interseeded plots, and I think it's because, for whatever reason, throughout the growing season, there was some lodging, things like that going on in the cornfield when there was just the corn monoculture. And for whatever reason, the plants just looked healthier, didn't have as much lodging when we had interseeded cover crops. So I had one that the cover crops actually improved yield. One location didn't make any difference at all. And then one location where the weed pressure was greater. There was a yield reduction. So really it was the three different ways it happened. And we can talk about more of that later, but it's variable, right? And I would, anyone looking to do this, make sure that you have your weed community under control, and it can work really good. It was no real detriment to yield when you had weeds under control.
Excellent. And then a question from Michelle, and it relates actually to the slide you currently have on the screen. In those experiments where you're doing the monoculture and the interseeding, were the corn seeds untreated organic seed, or were they treated with neonics and other things?
That's a great question. And, I was thinking about the same thing as I was out doing this study. So whoever asked that question is, you're a quick thinker, because it took me a long time to catch up on this. All studies that we do, if we can, and this study was one of them, we require that there are no insecticidal seed treatments, because it can change the results so drastically. So in all the fields, in all the data that you've seen thus far, those fields had no neonicotinoid seed treatments.
Okay.
And we'll pause on the rest of that until this next little bit when we talk.
Okay, and then again, I want to reassure Carrie, we're going to get you more specific technical questions. I guess my question is, most of the cover cropping that we're seeing and exposed to is, the crop, your cash crop ends, and then you put the rye in, and then you terminate it the next year. How much more complex logistically and equipment-wise is doing interseeding for a farmer? Because again, we have some non-operating landowners on the call. I think they're always nervous about, like, am I asking too much of my farmer? Right. Can you speak a little bit to that question?
Yeah, there are. Yes. So logistically, it can be more of a challenge, right? If you're planting cover crops outside of your typical cash crop growing window, where it's really, really simple to find a air seeder or a no-till drill or something like that to establish a pretty dense stand.
Right.
Folks who are interseeding cover crops, I will tell you, some people have excellent success simply broadcasting seeds on the soil surface, and they can get a really good stand that way. I will tell you, if you have superb soil cover, and then it's kind of interesting. The more soil cover that you have, the worse that works, right? So if you have more bare soil, you actually interseeding by simply broadcasting cover crop seeds can work really well.
Okay.
So the reason why we developed our cover crop interseeder, and why so many farmers are moving towards an interseeder specific, or fixing, fastening, equipping their equipment that they would come in and side dress nitrogen. That's a time where they would also come in and also have a moment where they would interseed cover crops at that time. So yeah, the equipment can be an issue. I just did another study about there's certain technologies, like for coating of cover crop seeds with clay compounds. It can improve your stand establishment. I did a study where we broadcasted cover crop seeds that had a clay on them, and it helped with a sort of pseudo seed to soil contact, and it did improve the stand establishment. But you're right, and a lot of these things I'm talking about, a lot of the principles, I hope that you all can, they're not just interseeding specific, right? So all the insects, they require sort of the same type of habitat that I'm getting at, right? They require more of a diverse community. They require flowering plants, and they require more of a green bridge, right? So just by, you're going to have incredible benefits to your insect community, even if you're not able to interseed cover crops, this year. It's going to become more and more of a common thing. more and more guys are creating interseeders that they can rent out to people. I think I'll stop there. Yeah, it's something that, look in your area. If someone's got an interseeder, they're going to be more than willing to help you out in lending that. And it's no trick, especially with, auto steer stuff. Ours is no, it's not $100,000 piece of equipment. It works really good. The guy that helped us this year, we made it for less than $1,000. And it was used on about 500 acres this year. No problem. You can drive it pretty quickly.
And I do actually, there are some questions, I'm sorry, there's some questions from Carrie I think do apply to this experiment. Was the farming being done all sort of controlled in terms of every other aspect of it? So she's asking, did they use pre-emergent or post-herbicides? What type? Right. Did you do tissue sampling of the corn to understand nutrient deficiency? How and when did you apply nitrogen? How much nitrogen? Was that all controlled by every field? No. Or okay.
Nope. So we wanted, and this goes for all projects that we do now. We're finding that in order to make our studies most, applicable across a wider scale, is that we are asking farmers to do the normal practices that they would do on their farms, and which is exactly what the case was in this study. The only thing is that they couldn't do a post-emergent herbicide after the cover crops were planted. I can tell you the greatest success for stand establishment is when we did use a cover crop, the interseeder, and the only herbicides that were used were a non-residual burn down right immediately previous to cover crop seeding. Right? Other than that, farmers chose what their needs were for fertilizer. That's exactly it. We wanted the farmers to be able to. We wanted to fit this project into their normal farming system and not have to adapt their whole farming system to fit the needs of this project.
Got it. Okay. So once you wrap up, I'm really looking forward to this next segment, and then I think we have some other questions coming in as well. Okay,
I'll try and cruise through this one without so much rambling this time. So
it's been good. It's been very good. It's
good.
It's not been a snooze fest. Let me assure you.
All right, good. I will hope we can continue with the non-snooze fest. People are probably getting hungry out there. Maybe they're eating right now. But anyways, all right. So great question that we had. Okay, let's say I'm interseeding cover crops to attract this army of beneficial insects, right? Okay, what happens if I'm using an insecticidal seed treatment like a neonicotinoid? Am I simply attracting beneficial insects to a well that's just been poisoned, right? So I want to figure that out. And here's just a photo of what that typically looks like. In this day and age, usually when you open up a bag of seed corn, you don't see just yellow corn seeds. You see them powdered with something. They're usually blue, green, or purple, something along those lines. And what's coating them is usually sometimes some sort of fungicide, but most commonly it's a type of insecticide. Okay. And as that insecticide making its way from the corn seed into the interseeded cover crops to potentially affect this army that I'm trying to attract. Okay, and neonicotinoid insecticides are the type of insecticide that are most commonly used as seed treatments, right? This is a class of insecticides, and it's got a few different species of insecticides within it. But anyways, neonicotinoids are the one that you need to know about, right? It's a neurotoxin that is used in all sorts of different applications, right? Tree injections, you can mix it in with soil, you can spray it, but most commonly it's used as a seed treatment. And the idea behind a seed treatment is to put the insecticide on the seed, plant the seed, and then as the roots grow from that treated seed and start taking in water from the surrounding soil, the insecticide, which is dissolved in the water, then enters the plant and protects that plant, especially when it's young. And the idea is for then throughout the growing season, the concentration of that insecticide to be less, and then hopefully almost non-existent by the time flowering happens and you're getting a lot of beneficial insects, predators and pollinators visiting that crop. And certainly you don't want it present if you're harvesting it for human consumption or animal feed. Okay, and how do neonicotinoids kill an insect, right? We always think, we hear a term insecticide, right? Insecticides kill insects, but it's not always just insects, right? So how we need to know a little bit more about some of these chemicals before we can label them as just being specific to one type of organism, right? Okay, so you and I and insects and birds and reptiles, we all have nerves, right? So we send messages from our brain to a gland in our body or to a muscle, right? To flex my arm, right? As a message sent from my brain down all these nerves, right? A chemical signal to then tell my muscle to flex. Okay, and this is what that message signal looks like here. If you look at these at the bottom of this slide, right, here comes the message from my brain, all right, and boop, there it goes. It keeps on going down the line, right, to a muscle or whatever, way down here on the right side. So between all these nerves, there's a gap, right? It goes, this message goes from one nerve, crosses this gap to the next nerve, and so on until it reaches its destination. Okay, this is called the synaptic cleft, right? We've all got them. Insects, birds, humans, we've all got these things, right? And naturally, to bridge this gap, we have these chemicals called neurotransmitters, right? And specifically with us and with insects and birds, it's called acetylcholine, right? And let's look at that signal again, right? Here comes a message from our brain, it hits the end, and then to bridge that gap, we use that chemical to perpetuate the signal. When a neonicotinoid is consumed by an animal, an insect, it's present, right, in this gap between our nerves at an unregulated level, right? Our body doesn't know how to regulate it. And it happens to bind to the same receptors on a postsynaptic nerve receptor as does our natural neurotransmitters, right? So let's see what that looks like. So they'll bind to the same spot. But guess what? They don't let go. Our body doesn't know how, insects' bodies don't know how to get rid of them, or they can't get rid of them that fast, right? So what it causes is a repeated stimulus of that nerve, leading to a repeated gland hormone being released from a gland, or a repeated muscle contraction, right? And ultimately, it leads to being paralyzed if you have enough of this in this highly regulated space between your nerves, right? So that is how a neurotoxin, a neonicotinoid, like a neonicotinoid, kills an insect, right? Or a bird or any other animal that has these types of nerves that gets too much of this insecticide. Let's look at it one more time. A normal nerve function looks like this. Message is sent, the message is relayed and then sent on. Insecticide comes in, binds sometimes irreversibly, leading to a perpetuated signal, right? And if you can imagine as an insect trying to get out of the sun or trying to go get some water or trying to catch prey, when your muscles are all firing and you're twitching, or if you can't make your way from a flower, you can't navigate from a flower or a field of flowers to the hive and back, or you can't hunt your prey and get nutrition because you're paralyzed. That's what kills you, right? Usually an insect will starve to death because it's just depleting all of its resources, unable to gain any more. Okay, and neonicotinoids sounds like this crazy word. All right. Most people think, oh, I don't use that on my corn. It doesn't say neonicotinoids on my bag of seed corn, because they have different names, right? The three most commonly used neonicotinoid seed treatments are these three words here, these long scientific words, but their trade names are written right here. So if you look on a bag of seed corn, if you don't know, or soybeans, look for those words to know whether or not your seeds have a neonicotinoid. Right, and we use these things so much, right? It's almost ubiquitous, right? Almost 80% of corn planted in the United States has a neonicotinoid seed treatment on it. And here's the crazy thing, okay? So that of the insecticide that's treated to each one of these corn kernels, between 2 and 20% of that insecticide actually enters that plant. Wait a minute, that's not a very large percentage, 2 to 20%. Where does the rest of the 80 to 98% go? Okay, remember this stuff is like sugar or salt. Think of it like sugar or salt. Once it hits water, it's dissolved, right? So really it goes wherever the water goes. And I want to know, is it entering the cover crops that's growing between my corn plants in an interseeded field, if those corn plants are treated? Okay, and just to give you a window of how much we use this stuff, this is just one of those types of insecticides, cloflanodin or poncho, and that's the map of use, right? And that's in the last couple of years about how much active ingredient we've used in neonicotinoid seed treatments. And I think maybe next week or week after, something like that, all of you that tune into this seminar series are going to hear from a person talking about neonics. And I've cited Tooker quite a bit in this presentation, so you'll get to hear straight from him about some more of these topics. Okay, so how do I test it? All right, so I went into a field. I planted a cornfield on 30-inch rows that had insecticide, right? A neonicotinoid insecticide called Cruiser Max 250. That's the lowest rate of neonic that you can get from that specific kind of insecticide, right? So trying to give these cover crops the best chance they could, right? Gave it the low rate, and I planted a single row of cover crop mixture. You can see the species over here between the rows of treated corn plants, right? I went out into the field and I sampled hairy vetch and cereal rye that were growing in between. And I did it 7 times throughout the growing season. And I used greenhouse grown samples as control, right? Because as we're finding out that even in fields that don't use a neonicotinoid seed treatment, we can test those tissues and oftentimes find neonics in them, right? So just because you're in a field that doesn't have seeds that are treated with neonics doesn't mean that they're not necessarily there, right? It might be a residue from years previous, or it might be moving through your field in the water, right? So we grew these in the greenhouse to ensure we had clean samples to compare. All right, and I get the sample from the field, I mush it up, I do all sorts of fancy chemistry, right? And then I do a test on it to see how much insecticide is in here. And interestingly, this kind of test is very similar to the one that you get if you're trying to figure out if you have had the coronavirus, right? It's an antibody test. So it's very, very similar. And what do we find? Okay, so let's look at our cereal rye tissue. Right here on the left side, this is the amount of insecticide per gram tissue. And down here we have day of the year, right? So early on in the growing season and then late. And as you can see, our hunch was correct, right? So that the water-soluble insecticide does indeed make its way from treated corn plants into the interseeded cover crop. And it's especially prevalent and abundant early in the growing season, falls for a lot of the growing season, and then there's a little bit of an uptick towards the end. And I think my hunch is that there's a slight uptick because as the corn plants start to senesce, their leaves fall down, you get a late season flush of growth from the cover crops, taking up more water during that time of year. So that's cereal rye. Let's look at hairy vetch. All right, same thing, same type of pattern was seen. A lot early on in the growing season, falling and then sneaking up towards the end of the year. especially quite large numbers even compared to the cereal rye. So the hairy vetch was taking it up at higher concentrations. Okay, so what does this mean? All right, what can we say? Well, something that we may have known, but didn't really know, right? We needed to test it and see. Now we do know that seed treatments, they don't stay where we put them, right? They go wherever the water goes, and it happens to be, in this case, into our interseeded cover crops. Okay, the metabolites, we didn't talk about that, right? Just know that when some of these insecticides enter a plant, they don't stay in the same chemistry as they do as they go into the plant. They can change the chemistry, and sometimes they can be even adapted into a more toxic chemical within the plants themselves. And we quantified that, and it was happening in some of our cover crops, right? So you have to be careful what you're looking for. If you're looking for just the compound that you treated the corn seeds with, well, you might not find it, right? It might have changed into a different compound, a different type of insecticide in the actual cover crops or corn plants themselves. Okay, so some implications here, all right? 2 to 20% of neonics enter the treated plant. Where does the rest go? Well, we just saw, yeah, it does go into the interseeded cover crop, but where else does it go? Okay, a couple of really interesting studies that have came out in the last few years we're starting to find neurotoxic neonicotinoid insecticides in our drinking water. Okay, this top one is in an agricultural region of Ontario, finding it in rural wells. And here, this is one of the better papers I've read in a long time. It's from the University of Iowa. And they went around to their campus, the campus of University of Iowa, and took samples from water fountains from the dorm rooms and found the 3 most commonly used neonicotinoid seed treatments, Poncho, Cruiser, and Gaucho, in the water from the water fountains on campus. Okay, where else does it go? I'm a fisherman and a hunter, as you know, so we're also seeing these neonics in places where we really don't want to see them, right? And disrupting food webs and food chains in aquatic systems. As you can see there on the left, my wife's got a nice walleye. It's from the picture from the Boundary Waters last fall. But yeah, there's, insects depend on invertebrate communities, right? And if the invertebrate community is shaken or adapted at all due to a water-soluble insecticide, well, that has ripple effects. Okay, and then out of our lab too, we have been quantifying neonic insecticides within the tissue of both captive and wild deer populations. So the big picture here, folks, the first study I talked about today is that, man, we can do a heck of a lot to stimulate a beneficial insect community, and not only the way that community looks, right, the structure, by diversifying and making them more abundant, but also we can change the way that community functions by making them better predators, right? If we have the right resources, if we're designing the right habitats for them to be successful in, right? They're our employees, and we're trying to get the most work out of those little buggers, right? And we're trying to take nuggets that we can learn from nature's greatest architect and translating them onto our own land where we can mimic but be very highly productive producers as well, right? And then secondly, we need to analyze and look at really carefully some of the existing pest management strategies and find out if they're compatible with some of these cutting edge new strategies that we're utilizing, such as interseeding cover crops, utilizing green bridges, right? Planting green into cover crops and improving the overall habitat quality of our farmland, right? So with that, I just want to thank all the farmers that allow me to do crazy stuff out on their fields. And then what's even crazier is they sort of, in years following some of these studies, they take the bull by the horns and continue to adapt it farther than I could have ever imagined. So the farmers are really the best, and the group I work mostly with, we're called the Soil Builders Club. It's just a group of local farmers that we got together for a reading club, essentially, and it's turned into much, much more than that. These guys are turning into a little co-op on their own, sharing cover crop seeds, sharing equipment. It's really, it's been fascinating to see them as a result of combining forces as neighbors, as farmers. Each one of their farms has become much more productive and profitable just because they're able to collaborate and share resources. And of course, the wonderful crew that I get to work with. I didn't collect and go through 65,000 insect specimens alone. It took an army of people. So with that, I know I'm probably out of time, but maybe if people wanted to hang around, there's a couple questions I can field a couple of those.
Awesome. So if you don't mind, maybe you could unshare your screen, and then if everyone who is available could also share not share their screen, if they could show your video so we can see your faces, who else is on the call. I think that would be fun to do. Any other questions? I know, actually, am I going to encourage Carrie to sort of maybe send that message separately? It's, I think, more about no-till and no-till questions.
Yeah.
Are there other insect questions, insects and cover crop questions that people would like to ask? I'm looking at the chat.
Well, people are thinking about that. The no-till question, if it's about interseeding and cover crops, establishing an interseeded cover crop in a no-till area, we have found tremendous success doing it, but we've really, to ensure our success, we've needed the interseeder. Broadcasting cover crop seeds in a no-till situation, because you've got extra armor on the soil surface, you usually have a lot more granivorous insects, so things that are consuming weed seeds and whatnot. They're a lot more prevalent on the soil surface, which is a good thing when you have a no-till situation. So getting your cover crop seed in the ground becomes even more important when you're in a no-till system.
Got it. And so those farmers that took part in the testing, are some of them continuing to use sort of interseeding on their own after the study?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's wild. There are actually all three of the farms that I did this study on for a couple of years. Every single one of them has continued to interseed, despite me not doing the study this year. They're all doing it. And they're taking it a step further. As I had in that one picture, one of the farmers wants to see even more growth out of the cover crop. So he's doing the same corn seed population, but he's doing a skip row. He's doing 2 rows of corn and then a skip row where he's doing 3 rows of cover crops in that.
Wow.
In that row.
Yep. Are there tools or resources you'd recommend? I know Stephanie from Xerxes Society mentioned that the Midwest Cover Crop Council has great resources and tools. Any other resources, websites that you'd point to, like 2 or 3 for both landowners and farmers to look at?
Midwest Cover Crop Council is an excellent one. They've got a really nice cover crop selection tool. Okay. I don't want to, put a plug in for any specific company or whatever, but I guess sure. I'll have to, because there's a green cover seed out of Bladen, Nebraska. Their website has a very, very specific and involved smart mix. I forgot what it's called exactly. Smart mix tool. It you sort of tell it where you are, what your goals are. And it spits out some really great options for you. It doesn't mean that you have to purchase from them. They are excellent folks there, but it's a great tool. So between Midwest Cover Crop Council and then that selection tool from Green Cover Seed, those are really great tools. And SARE, awesome. The SARE website has all sorts of ideas for and case studies for trying sort of these new cutting edge techniques, and scrolling through some of the previous projects that they've funded, you can search certain key terms and whatnot in their report database, and have some really great insight as to what people have tried and what's worked and what's not worked.
Okay. Are you seeing like and I only have one or two more questions. It's gone a little longer than I expected. Are you seeing a lot more? Do you have reason for hope in terms of the energy and momentum that's getting behind using cover crops, and farmers being willing to sort of experiment and be creative in that way?
Right. I have extreme hope. Year after year, when we look at the cover crop use survey data, it's to the point now where cover crops, especially more simple cover crop mixtures and planting green, your soybeans into cereal rye or a simple mixture, is becoming mainstream. It's not all that impressive anymore if you are planting soybeans into green growing cereal rye, coming back, and then either rolling, terminating, or spray terminating your cereal rye. Really, that's old school now. That's so basic, and it's so well tested that everyone just knows that that's a good idea. There's no it helps in terms of insects. It helps especially in terms of disease prevention on soybeans to have that type of system. So I mean, just having large producers that a lot of local, smaller producers sort of look to as the best farmer in the area, the big guys, for them to be doing cover crops, it's really helped with the groundswell of people adopting all these other techniques.
Excellent. And then there was a question here. What was your grant funding? Where did your grant funding come from for conducting this research?
The study, I flashed it up there on the final slide, but the majority of the money was from a SARE research grant. The rest of it, there was considerable amount from farmer donors who are in finding out this information. So we are, awesome. Yep. So if farmers have questions, we've got the tools and the person. Oh, that's great. Like building that interseeder, it was a group project with farmers. You just cobble together what you need to get the research done.
Okay. And then can you say like in 1 minute, maybe, about the research work you're doing with General Mills? I think people will be interested to hear that such a big company is interested in this kind of work.
Okay. Yeah. So we're in this project. One component of this monstrous study taking place across the southern and northern Great Plains, through Canada and Kansas. And what we're doing on farms that are transitioning to a more regenerative model of farming, utilizing cover crops, diversifying their crop rotation, implementing livestock, and those farmers that are make these farmers they want to make them greater contributors to their supply chain for their products, to reduce, in order to reduce General Mills' overall carbon budget. And so there's a multifaceted project. We're just one small component of it, looking at the insect community. There's guys looking at wildlife, the birds, the soil health, the economics, and the sociology of the farmers. And it's really important, I think, for people listening to me say this, the fact that a company like General Mills is starting this type of project, is that if you want to be ahead of the curve in terms of who's buying products off farms in the future, I think we're going to continue to see entities be a little bit more picky about how the products are raised, how the commodities are raised. So those guys, those farmers, those guys and gals that are already utilizing regenerative practices are going to be ahead of the game, and their products are going to have much more value added to them as we move forward with these types of companies looking into changing where their food is coming from.
Well, that is super encouraging. One thing we didn't get to was your kind of life story, how you got into regenerative agriculture. Unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to pass on that one.
Okay.
But I think your passion for farming and for wildlife, and I think at one point you had felt like farming just has to sacrifice life to sort of be productive, and you've clearly come to a different perspective, and frankly devoted your life to really supporting that. And I just want to give you a lot of credit for spending time with us, really being passionate about what you're doing, talking to no one's face, just kind of going off and looking at your computer screen and just talking in such an animated way. And frankly, even the middle school cafeteria metaphor was an awesome one.
Good.
So I super appreciate what you and the Ecdysis Foundation are doing. So thank you so much for that. I also want to thank everyone else for participating. Just a quick note, next 2 Thursdays, we have the last 2 webinars. Next Thursday is going to be Iowa State University talking about prairie strips and how those can help the farmer as well as insect biodiversity. I think you'll enjoy that. And then the following last Thursday on July 30th will be Paul Muggy from Iowa and Anna Crabtree-Jones from Montana. Both of them organic, and I think beyond organic in terms of being creative and regenerative. And I think it'll be really great to hear from farmers who are doing this, how it helps them profitability-wise, financial-wise, but also how they feel about farming itself. I think you're going to find that they're very creative, fun people with deep values around how they farm, which I think you'll enjoy hearing from. Again, thanks everyone for being part of this. Thank you for caring about farming and for being thoughtful in all you do. Have a great day.